All right. Okay, good. Before we begin, I just have one logistics change. The session, National Patterns and Community Initiatives with Amy Goodall-Ayers in room 209, that time is going to be split between that presentation as well as the Earned Income Tax Credit and its complexities with Rebecca Dial. They're gonna split that time. So if you go to that presentation within that hour, you'll get to join both of those presenters and have a discussion about both of those items. So I hope you're having a good time so far. We're very fortunate to have Professor Kirk Emerson. She is Professor of Practice in Collaborative Governance at the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona. And she was enthusiastically recommended to us by our own Professor Tina Nabachi. The two of them are writing a book together, Collaborative Governance Regimes, which, and I'm quoting here from an earlier journal article where they define collaborative governance regimes, the processes and structures of public policy decision-making and management that engage people constructively across the boundaries of public agencies, levels of government, and/or the public, private, and civic spheres in order to carry out a public purpose that could not otherwise be accomplished. The topic of which is certainly relevant to the topic of our conference and to the wicked problems of our time. And I have to say that as I was communicating with Professor Emerson, I kept sending her a bio and saying, okay, how does this look? And she would say, oh, that's great, but cut out that paragraph or cut out another paragraph. So I'm not sure if she just wants me to get to the point and let her talk, or if it's a testament to her modesty, but she certainly has many accomplishments. And I just want to say that she has a long-standing career in the fields of environmental collaboration and conflict resolution, both as a practitioner and a trainer, as a researcher and an administrator. And she is the former director of the U.S. Institute for Environmental Conflict Resolution of the Morris K. Udall Foundation from 1998 to 2008, and has worked in environmental conflict resolution at the Udall Center, as well as Bucks County Planning Commission, which is in the state of Pennsylvania. Received her BA from Princeton University, her master's degree in city planning from MIT, and her PhD in political science and public policy from Indiana University. So please welcome Professor Kirk Emerson.
Good afternoon. I should say, yes, I have to confess, I was in the 1970s and in planning school when Riddle and Weber were writing about wicked problems. That says something about how old I am. But it was a cool term. Wicked was, we were catching wicked waves, surfing, not that I was surfing, but I mean, wicked cool was a cool thing. And I guess that's just one more dimension of wicked problems you should remember as students and lifelong learners of how to deal with these problems. That it's cool. It is intellectually intriguing. It matters. It's critical. It's worth the struggle. It's worth the time. You need a lot of patience. But what else more gratifying would there be than to be involved in these very complicated human social problems? So I think you've given enough of my background. I'm delighted to be back at Syracuse. I did teach a semester at ESF, and I've been associated with PARC and have done a couple of workshops here on collaborative governance. And so I enjoy coming back, and I'm glad to see, well, there was sun out here a few moments ago, but that the snow wasn't too bitter. In fact, I've heard there wasn't much snow, despite the snow in the rest of the Northeast here in Syracuse. So. Well, the topic I threw out a month or so ago, let's talk about context. And of course, I want to talk about a lot more than context. And as I have thought about this, I want to talk about wicked problems, but also draw your attention increasingly to wicked collaboration and how we think about and make assumptions about cross-boundary collaboration. And I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to think about this a little harder in preparation for the conversation today. So I'm going to be talking about rethinking the collaboration fix as you address these wicked, cool problems. And also, just so you know, even though it's 80 degrees and sunny in Tucson, where I hail from, we have too our share of wicked problems that express themselves locally, that are part of a transboundary context on the US-Mexico border, and are definitely part of, symptomatic of, and drive global wicked problems. But here we have a vastly growing city, and you can see those barren mountain ranges out there with serious water challenges. We have inadequate infrastructure for energy, not just renewable, but more broadly. We've got serious challenges with border crossers who continue to come across our border, and I'm going to talk a little bit more in a case about the illegal immigration in a moment. We have 13, 14 years now of drought in the Southwest that is only going to continue. That's the new baseline. Serious water scarcity challenges. We have returning veterans who face homelessness and inadequate or uncoordinated care and services. I know there's going to be a discussion about that this afternoon around homelessness. And we have, again, connected to climate change and our persistent droughts, serious wildfire problems that inflict us across the Western landscape. So wicked problems abound. In fact, what is not a wicked problem might be something worth considering now. Are we increasing the number of wicked problems we're facing? Have these problems always been wicked and we're now just realizing their multidimensionality? I think that part of the challenge for us is to understand, while wicked problems and that concept has been around since the 70s, our context for governing and resolving these issues has changed since the 70s. And I would argue that we have a failure of governance that has making these problems even more wicked and increasing problems that might ordinarily in other eras or in other systems be solvable, more complex. In fact, we know that the definition of wicked problems relates to the context in which they are found. But one of the most significant issues for us, certainly in the US, is this concept of the hollow state, and that we're not simply shrinking our governments at the federal level, the state level, from resources and person power, human resources, but we are hollowing it out. Now we spend more on contractors than we spend on our personnel budget in the federal government. We are a contracting out state. And whether or not that is performing or is correct or not, put that aside for a moment, it has an effect on the nature and the quality and the functioning of those who are in the formal government sector and how they can then address wicked problems. They have become managers of contractors and are even further removed from what is happening on the ground as policy implementation takes place there. So the hollowing out of the state, the disappearing state, really leads us to questions, and I think collaborative governance leads us to questions about whether we need to conceptualize a whole new theory of the state. Because something is amiss here, something is changing. We also have, and this was true in the 70s, but I think even more so, fragmented authorities and jurisdictions. This is the Tucson Basin, and you can see the build out up to the steep slopes in the mountain ranges. And, oops, and here is just a shot of land tenure in the basin and how complex that is. Blue being private, but we have tribal lands to the west. We have an enormous amount of federal land, as well as state trust land, and an extraordinary array of jurisdictions that have to work together. And I don't think this is necessarily unique to us in the West. The public lands issue may be, but we have those kinds of jurisdictional problems everywhere. The decline in trust has been documented by many. This is just one shot by the Pew Research Center that shows how trust in government, how survey respondents are viewing trust in government out to beyond 2010. It seems to rise and fall a bit with who's president, but I don't think that's the only interpretation of this chart. We are losing confidence in our institutions of government, as well as other institutions. Talked a little bit at lunch about the scientific institution. Additional factors that are leading to this failure in governance is the political polarization that was mentioned earlier, and how our country has always had a partisan political climate, and it has been bad at various times in our history. But from this chart, you can see how significantly apart the partisan analysis of in the House of Representatives in the blue line and the Senate in the purple line are. We are facing a demonstrable shift in the disaggregation, I guess you could say, of the political sphere. And this has led to and is connected with, of course, decline in civil discourse. And without civil discourse in the public arena, how are we to deliberate and produce effective dialogue and deliberation on these complex, wicked problems? And finally, of course, we find ourselves with a lot of dysfunctional leadership, a lot of public decision making that may not be well informed, or we have a lot of public decision making that isn't happening, and we're not making decisions in face of all the foregoing trends. So we've got a changing context that I think needs to be recognized, making it much more difficult to address these wicked problems, and we can't fully address them without acknowledging this political sphere and understanding the changes in our governmental institutions, in our civil society, and how it is reorganizing itself in a response to that. So, in the definitions, the classic definitions, and as they've evolved over time of wicked problems, there is a baseline understanding that these problems cross boundaries, disciplinary boundaries, authorities, jurisdictions, sectors, and that in order to solve them, at the very least, there has to be collaboration of some kind among those representing different interests, having different arrays of authority and power, and that we really need to get serious about this collaboration stuff. And I do think that that field has grown up over time, in part with the acknowledgement that these wicked problems require it and demand it. So I want to say something about collaboration. We have now, this is not a new field, we have several decades of experience with stakeholder engagement in this country and also in developing countries, though I'm going to be speaking specifically about the US today. And we have some great examples of effective stakeholder engagement and collaborative governance, primarily at the local level. Earlier there was discussion about what's the right scale. It is a question I'll be referring to again as to how to scale up and what gets lost in the shuffle or not. But we have advanced our thinking about collaboration and what Tina and I refer to as collaborative governance regimes. Our experience with collaboration, stakeholders' experience with collaboration, is not 100% positive, you might be surprised to know. There are several challenges now as we experiment with engaging people. We have learned that it is very hard work, that this is not easy. You don't just throw stakeholders into the room and magically they talk to each other. Magically, at the end of the day, they're singing Kumbaya and problem solved, they're going home happy and refreshed. This is really hard work. It doesn't come naturally to us as human beings to talk outside our tribes and to figure out how to define terms, come up with a common language, build commitment around the challenges we face, and actually develop that shared capacity we need to move forward together. So it is hard work, and we're asking a lot of people. There are enormous complexities in the accountabilities. Imagine, if you will, that you're representing a constituency at the table in a stakeholder process. It could be large with several thousand people. It could be 5 people in a negotiation setting. But you are accountable to your constituency, right? You're accountable to the group that you are in and have created this sphere for discourse. You are responsible to yourself and your own professional or personal rules, norms, values, right? That may not be exactly in line with your constituency. In fact, your constituency may be divided. And then fourth, we're talking about public problems. So there's a larger fourth accountability to the public, to the broad public composed of all of this diverse set of interests and so forth. So we're asking an awful lot of people. And as managers, you're learning a lot about how to be accountable to your boss and to your organization or your corporation or your public leader or your political boss. And here we're asking you to consider being accountable at 4 levels. This is hard stuff. There are, and I've participated in processes that have been fatiguing, and repeat players get tired. And you often see the same people at the table around different sets of problems at the community scale for sure. People get tired. They particularly get tired devoting all of their weekday evenings to meetings that don't lead us to solutions, right? They go on ad nauseum. There are high transaction costs here, and often there are insufficient funds, resources, staff to do it right. So the burden falls then on all of the stakeholders, many of whom from the public or the NGO, community, civil society, really don't have those resources to keep it going. Also, as we have turned collaboration into a buzzword, it's become routinized. And we read our cookbooks, and we are newly hired in an agency, and our boss says, okay, let's do stakeholder engagement, and pull out the dots, pull out the maps, pull out the workshop formats. There's a routinization to this that can, I think, distance us from the authenticity of what once were known as ad hoc, customized processes. So beware. There are those, and I think this is a growing field for you PhDers out there, to consider the systemic power imbalances that remain in the collaborative sphere and have to be dealt with and faced honestly. There are always power imbalances, and just because you're sitting at the table and at the same table with others does not mean you bring the same level of power. You may have different sources of that power, but this is something that has to be talked about a little further. Also, it is a well-known strategy I've used as a mediator and a facilitator to pick off the low-hanging fruit, solve a simple problem, right? And then you get buy-in and everyone feels warm and fuzzy. Really important strategy, but you do have to move to the next step, which is the harder problem to solve, right? And the devil's in the details. So transitioning from the low-hanging fruit to the more complex, higher fruit above in those branches above us is and remains a challenge for many, particularly with wicked problems on the table. Collaborative processes are vulnerable to external and internal threats. Talk about this a little bit more when I address adaptation. But because they're not usually hardwired, as most people think about collaboration, a stakeholder leader leaves the table, political transition occurs after an election, the grant expires. There are lots of vulnerabilities to collaboration that need to be acknowledged and prepared for and thought about, especially now that we have many of these going on for 2 or decades or so. How do they sustain themselves? Big question. And then finally, we raise a lot of expectations on the part of the public and stakeholders by engaging people and encouraging them to give voice to their interests. So are we delivering on the democratic promise, and are we delivering on the substantive solution side? And performance is something I'll talk about a little bit more as well. Okay, so we're not tabula rasa here anymore. We've been doing this for quite a long time, and many of you are researching and are building on the research of others around what works, what doesn't. That said, we still tend to think of stakeholder engagement as an independent variable. You just throw it in there, and then something's going to pop out. But all collaboration is not the same, and that's a point that Tina and I have been working on for several years now. And as a result, has cross-boundary collaboration itself become a wicked problem, deserving of our attention? Should we not be thinking of this as a dependent variable? Okay, well, Jack has put me, oops, I'm not there quite yet. Okay, I want to step back for just a moment and talk about this notion of cross-boundary, cognitive cross-boundary challenges. We have, since the 70s, been talking about interdisciplinary work. And I would add, as many do, I'm not unique here, that we also need more inter-theoretical work, even within disciplines. So if you are an entering PhD student in political science, you are quickly led to choose between political behavior and institutions. Nod, yeah? Can't do both. Not right. Not intellectually pure. Got to be more theoretical. So there's a problem. And then if you are coming into a school of public administration or public affairs as a young PhD student, you are probably going to face a choice between focusing on institutions or networks, right? Because they don't really crisscross. And then finally, if you're in management, some of you are going to be focusing on processes, on conflict resolution and conflict management, or you're going to be working on hardwired networks or institutions. Well, there you go. Right at the very beginning of your intellectual life, you are forced to make these choices and choose a theory you're going to develop further and articulate and become part of the literature and that journal segment of the intellectual corpus. So just beware, because what is being demanded of this fix of collaboration is a much more systematic or systemic integration of these theories and ideas, okay? And that's very important and hard to do at the same time as your dissertation. So I like this idea that, of course, and Tina and I have been working on our own Rube Goldberg kind of system and integrating framework for collaborative governance, but you really need to, if you're going to operationalize this as a practitioner, if you're going to study it as a researcher, understand the role of leadership in inspiring people to work together, institutions in incentivizing people, getting to the table, keeping them at the table, networks that connect people, not simply at the table, but around it, and processes that build the social capital and relationships as well. So I think I'm preaching to the choir, you're nodding heads, but we don't often think about this and reflect ourselves on how much our training, our professors, tend to move us to different theories and literatures and make it difficult to argue for these more integrated systems approaches to collaboration, let alone wicked problems. So I encourage you to think about advocating for that. Jack's already helped with defining collaborative governance regimes. What do I mean by collaborative governance? Processes and structures of public policy, decision-making, and management, engaging people constructively. Note we don't use the word consensus. Across the boundaries of public agencies, levels of government, and/or public, private, and civic spheres to carry out a purpose, a public purpose that could not otherwise be accomplished. Some people would argue that collaborative governance really is about government-sponsored processes working with cross-sector groups and stakeholders. That's the Ansel and Gash definition. Others would say it's all about bottom-up, emergent systems that don't start with the government sector at all. Ours is a little more comprehensive of that, and I think the other definitions would include the guts of what we are saying here. And beneath the understanding of collaborative governance are 4 essential elements. It's cross-boundary. We are trying to engage autonomous organizations or constituencies. We are looking at adding public value, focusing on public purpose. There's some kind of interdependency here that even moves us to work together. And finally, entails voluntary engagement to some extent in reciprocal relations and shared authority and decision making. This is what I want to focus on for the rest of the talk. There are certain assumptions behind that last bullet that I'm beginning to question. Tina and I are talking a lot about, and I just want to put them out there for you, and that'll stimulate a conversation. Oh my God, I can't believe we only have a few more minutes. All right. And I want to question the notion of collaborative arrangements being primarily or exclusively lateral in their structure, that they're only related to voluntary engagement. You couldn't be mandated to collaborate. No role for coercion in collaboration. That collaboration is per se, by definition, adaptive. The sustainable science folks have argued and write a lot about transboundary governance with the assumption that these are more adaptive structures than hardwired institutional or hierarchical structures. I'm not so sure about that. Or we have to pay attention to it. And then finally, if we have time, and we're not really going to have time if we want to have questions, is the question of performance. And let me also say, anytime you want to ask a question, please do. I'm totally open for that.
We have till about 2:30, and I didn't want to give you
Oh, great.
false time
All right. I should be done talking by now, though. I've already talked too much. Okay, so I was going to just give you 2 very quick examples of what I mean by collaborative governance in very different contexts. This is an Eskimo village, the Yupik, federally recognized tribe in Newtok on the Alaskan coast. The red dot there shows you where they are. And there are about 400 people in this community. They have lived in an array of 65 buildings on the edge of the Bering Straits. You can see the Ninglik River there and Newtok River. They were placed there by national education policy. You were talking about education policy earlier this year, an unintended consequence that this nomadic fishing tribe had to be located at a place where there could be a school run by the BIA. They couldn't be recognized as a community unless they had a school and they had to settle. And unfortunately, we settled them and many scores of other traditional communities in Alaska on the coast that is now eroding away with melting permafrost and in dire straits, many of these communities because of climate change in large part, but they need to relocate. So here's just an example of flooding effects on this community. You can see it's soon to be gone. The studied rates of erosion are multiplying far beyond what they had anticipated. This is dry time and floods that continue to occur. They have, in fact, been able to negotiate with the Department of Interior and Congress a land exchange on a previous wildlife refuge to another area that is higher ground, and if they could only get the funds together to move, they would. But the Newtok Planning Group came about. It started in about 2006. There is no formal authority at the state, federal, or the local level with any responsibility to move this village. And there's no money. And the studies of the cost effectiveness of moving versus mitigating are ambiguous. But this is a community that wants to stay together, not to disperse. And the leadership of the town council and the native corporation brought together some 20 different agencies and worked for many, many, many years, slowly piecing together bits of money here and there in voluntary labor. They train themselves to learn how to build boat ramps, learn how to build houses, slowly to work towards resettlement of this community. I think maybe 4 houses have been built. A barge has been built. But it is an example, and I've not gone into it in great depth, of enormous collaborative power despite complete dispersed jurisdiction and very fragmented authority, working and being stimulated and driven from outside the government structure. Another example, quite the opposite, a cooperative arrangement, and we would argue collaborative governance regime within the federal government, within the Department of Interior, the Department of Agriculture, and DHS along the US-Mexico border. You can see the environmental footprint of border crossing there and the nature of the fence, which this is supposedly a pedestrian fence that stops just up the top of the hill. You could walk around it. And then it moves into Normandy fence for vehicle barriers. But just to describe the wickedness of this challenge, we've got 2,000 miles in the southwest border, okay? 4 states, California to Texas. And over 50% of the illegal traffic goes through the Tucson sector, and half of that goes through the Coronado National Forest, okay? Despite the fact that we've moved from 2,000 Border Patrol agents right after 9/11 to 40,000 Border Patrol agents for 50-some miles of border is really phenomenal. We have a militarized border in the Southwest. If you don't believe me, come visit. And despite the fact that the rates of crossing have diminished significantly and the interdictions have declined as well, we hope so with 40,000 agents and a fence, we still have 200 people on average dying every year in the desert. This is a wicked problem with an enormous local manifestation. So after 9/11 and 2 federal acts to secure the border by building a fence within a 2-year period and the ability given by Congress to DHS to waive all federal laws in the purpose of building that fence in those 2 years, all environmental, cultural, religious freedom laws. The departments were able to come together, create a coordinated memorandum of understanding, model the leadership ethic of collaboration, and foster work on the ground laterally between Border Patrol agents and, in this case, the Forest Service, but also Fish and Wildlife Service, parks, and to some extent the tribe, but not excessively. So what I wanted to paint here is simply that within the formal hierarchy, interagency collaboration, and I would argue collaboration, was developed with a combination of leadership and development of norms and institutional structures and incentives that worked across the agencies within Interior and Border Patrol, DHS and Border Patrol, and then down to the state and sector levels for enforcement to bring the public land managers who are concerned about the effects of crossing and interdiction, right, together with the Border Patrol concerned about national security to work cooperatively and mitigate impacts and maximize coordination together. Okay, so two very different examples, different kinds of collaborative regimes. So, rethinking assumptions about lateral structures. So here we are. First of all, it's important to remember, to know that whatever lateral system of collaboration you might come up with, it exists within a much broader array of social and organizational networks that need to be taken into account. And in fact, you depend on that network to implement the agreements and outcomes of your collaborative engagement, right? But it's very important also to think about how to design collaborative systems to integrate with formal authorities. In my opinion, that in working cross-sector, we have to really acknowledge the value and importance of hierarchy. And if we just think about collaborative structures and reify collaborative governance regimes as outside of the way we work or who we're dealing with, I think we're going to put it in a box. It's going to become very precious. And we have to begin to question how effective that's going to be in the long run. Tang and Masmanian, for example, contrast different institutional forms: government hierarchy, outsourcing, the contracting I was talking about before, market-based arrangements, and collaborative governance arrangements. Why not be drawing on all of those arrangements, working together and transforming the way we govern rather than separating out collaborative governance from among our forms? Let's try to integrate them. Let's talk about voluntariness for a moment. It is really rare. Imagine the last collaborative process you were involved in, even a study team here in one of your classes. People come to the table for different reasons. And it would be rare to find a group of people that are there exactly at the same level of voluntariness, if you will, okay? Some people are there because of peer pressure. Some people are there because they've got to get their grades up. Some people are there because they have a responsibility because they're the TA for the course. People have different levels of voluntariness, and I think we need to be thinking of this not as a dichotomous variable, but as a continuous variable, and appreciate more what is driving people to be working together, and understanding and acknowledging those differences, building on those differences, rather than just assuming we're all working on this together. Okay. Another characterization of our policymaking process from Ansel and Gash again distinguishes adversarialism, working through the courts, our legal system, managerialism in the bureaucracy, and then collaborative governance as this third alternative. Likewise, tools are often organized in the same way. We think about competition in the marketplace, we think about coercion and the use of force and regulation, and then cooperation is the tool of choice in collaborative governance. Well, I would add that we are losing something if we're just talking about the top of the pyramid here, and that in getting things done, in framing the problem, in designing solutions, in building public discourse, and implementing and providing feedback as a result of that implementation, you're going to have to choose among many tools, many incentives, many institutional forms, especially on wicked problems. Okay, adaptive capacity, and I'm going to stop right after this one. I don't think I'm going to get into performance unless you really want me to. But as I said, perhaps you've witnessed situations where even after 5 or 10 years of investment in a collaborative forum, building relationships, building social capital, the group can't quite shift to the next generation of leaders. Doesn't happen, you know. Or you start something with a grant and you can't get the next round of funds to continue the collaborative process. You've got to operate on a shoestring from the beginning, and so you don't think about best practices, you cut corners, and you can't sustain the engagement, the commitment you're asking of others along the way, okay? In fact, I think these processes are very vulnerable, and we need to spend more attention on the relationship between the collaborative capacity we're building and adaptive capacity, and not to assume that stakeholder engagement, cross-boundary collaboration is de facto adaptive. So another thing that I'm working on with a colleague of mine, Andrea Gerlach, who writes a lot about collaborative learning, is trying to pick apart the way in which, this is actually about climate change, but generalized from that, triggers that affect the collaborative dynamics and help us build capacity. And what is it about collaborative capacity that advances appropriate adaptation? So, for example, the knowledge that's developed and shared, either new knowledge or shared knowledge through collaboration among stakeholders, we argue, creates something called cognitive flexibility in people that enables adaptation to new information, to changes in the system. Likewise, a sensitivity to others' concerns and different perspectives then builds a commitment to a process that will withstand exogenous shocks, okay? So I will conclude here and just say that I think the intersection here, particularly with climate change and the importance of adaptive capacity, is to explore how to make our collaborative regimes more robust, and that part of that may lie well in how we understand collaborative capacities as we build them. So I will be glad to take questions.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to try and make this as much of a discussion as we can. So if someone's asking a question and you want to sort of tag on to that question, or you have sort of an added point to make, maybe kind of shout out like hot pursuit, or you know, raise your hand or point to me or something, and I'll try and bring it to you, and we'll see kind of how integrative we can get here. So who has a question? Virginia.
So I guess one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is long-term sustainability of collaborative governance regimes. And I've noticed that, you know, you said that different people have different levels of voluntariness. And in some collaborative governance regimes, you have funding that you can bring in staff assistance that helps do those day-to-day not facilitation, but makes it feasible for them to people who have jobs to work together on this project that may be outside of their job description. Great. Do you have any thoughts on best practices for maybe organizations, institutions, agencies that are trying to work together without that kind of level of support? And have you seen examples of successful collaborations? So I guess maybe one thing I'm pointing to is it's hard to, I mean, it seems like leadership is a key element, and initiating leadership is a key element. And are there ways to get around that problem and institutionalize collaboration when there maybe aren't resources?
This is such an important question, and there are many different answers, right? There's no silver bullet here. I think succession planning is really important on the leadership side. Malpai Borderland Group, for example, a ranching collaborative, is now in its second generation of leaders. And 3 years before they knew some people would be retiring out of their roles in the board function, they started working with the next generation and integrating them in. So in that sense, it's very much like a formal organizational transition. That group and others that I know of, at least certainly in land management or watershed collaboratives, have rotated that resource coordination function, the chair function, or the meeting management function. It's important to note that those who work in networks, Provan and Millward have written about network effectiveness, and they too are saying that the key determinant, aside from resources, of network effectiveness in the public services arena is having a network manager. So I think this is a really important function, and as these emergent collaborations develop, has to be addressed in some way, and it may limit your ability to act until you have the resources understood and planned out for some time. you may also have to sort of shut the doors for a while and then open up again when the opportunity arises. But whether it's grantsmanship or finding deep pockets, of course, part of the theory in a diverse group is that they all bring different resources to the table, and you can leverage other resources as well. So you can't just do that at the beginning. You have to be thinking about the collaborative management regime functioning as well as what you're working towards. But you can't even have that conversation until you're a functioning group, right? And that's, people want to be involved.
You can. Does anyone have a question sort of on that point? I'm just going to let Virginia get a quick follow-up in.
Sorry, and just on the resources thing, do you think it's possible to have a sustained collaboration when you don't have a network manager and you maybe don't have funding for that collaboration?
Well, I mean, it depends on how resource dependent you are. If you're talking about people coming together not on a crisis or conflict, but on an opportunity basis, and they enjoy doing what they're doing, like a bridge club, you can do a bridge club for a long time, right? So it sort of depends on how ambitious you are, or how able you are to scale back when the resources aren't there, and then to scale up when they can be. So got to think about that. Yeah.
I'm Sanaullah Abru from Pakistan. I'm here as a Fulbright Fellow at Maxwell School. I work in Pakistan Customs, so a lot of border issues and border collaboration and organized crimes. We are facing these issues on a daily basis. I would like to hear from you about the collaboration in the organized crimes. For example, if you take the examples of Tohono region on the Mexico and Arizona border, that you have, you can see the human trafficking issues, the drug trafficking issues, and so many other organized crimes issues over a particular point. And these points, there's a project of black spots here in Maxwell School which identified so many black spots on the global map. So we say that it is, those areas are not governed by the governments, but by the people, non-state actors. So how do you see the collaboration among these non-state actors and organized crimes of different levels, one thing. Another question, when we talk about this collaborative strategy to tackle these wicked problems, we see that we have very competing values and competing goals in the organizations. For example, when we are in customs, we see something, drugs is our mandate, but human trafficking is not our mandate. So there is another agency who is working for the human trafficking. And law and order, there is another agency which is working for law and order. So you have different agencies with different values and vision and mission statements. Sometimes we compete with each other. So when we apply this collaborative strategies among different organizations, making task force and these kind of things, but they doesn't work on the sustainable basis. And I don't know about how the Homeland and Security work here in America, because it was a creation of a new institutions. So whether a new institution is a more better idea to tackle these wicked problems, or really the collaborative kind of strategy will work or not. So your take on these issues. Thank you.
Wow, that's a lot. Well, how much time do we have? Oh, I have so many things I could say. Well, on this last point, yes, there are, of course, DHS was created anew, but the agencies were assembled from other places within the federal government, for the most part, with the idea that unification was going to improve coordination. But all these agencies do have different cultures and different missions, and they have learned in the field to some extent how to work together, but we still have that competition. In the example that I was demonstrating, I've been interviewing for the last 4 years, actually, different points, public land managers who have missions and cultures and are specialized around protecting natural resources and providing safe recreation. Very, very different, much more lateral organizations. The head of the Forest Service, or though that's actually more hierarchical, but head of a wildlife refuge is the master of his domain. And of course, you have very hierarchical, pretty military-like structures within DHS. So how to connect them and get them talking together was a huge barrier, but leadership at the highest levels at that time, I think, broke through that. And they had staying power to create and send the formal and informal signals down to the ground, where in fact there had been some collaboration going on the ground. They developed cooperative strategic plans. They elevated up the issue of interoperability among radio frequencies from the different agencies. They created ways to work through environmental assessments and deal with some of the wilderness issues. I'm not in any way wanting to greenwash the challenges there, but I think they did it in this case. On the issue of the use of collaboration for less noble means, hey, we don't have a corner on collaboration, that is for sure. And I guess I would refer you to Dr. Millward, Brent Millward's work on dark networks, because he is studying, and has been for some time, how terrorist organizations have developed networks that cross all boundaries except their own mission. And then finally add to that, on the other hand, the cartels in Mexico, as I understand it, are very, very hierarchically organized. And they export those hierarchies to Europe and other places who are getting in, or they are cornering the drug market there as well. So I think you could argue that those have become hardwired, very formal institutions and well networked into supportive communities, which is part of why it is so difficult for the government to deal with them. But there's someone way back there.
Hi.
Sorry. So I have Sheila, and then James, and then Rima, and Amy. And so, so since there's 4 questions, and there'll probably be more, we have a 15-minute break scheduled between 2:30 and 2:45. Okay. So I'd like to maybe just at 2:30, if you have a presentation that you're giving that you need to get ready for, feel free to get up and go ahead and do that. And at 2:45, we will plan to start the next section on time. So if you feel like you need to get up to use the restroom or take a break before that, please join us for the next section. But we're going to go ahead and extend into that 15-minute period.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Emerson, for coming in today. I have a question in regards to the 4 approaches of governance, in that you were explaining how we need to be more integrative than contrasting, market-based approach, and collaborative governance, authoritative. How do we work with that in regards to how technology today is used, innovation? At times, some scholars have argued that innovation actually creates more wicked problems in that within an organization, when there's new management, a lot of times those product initiatives or those initiatives for progress and development actually get reversed. And then looking at how do we work with these big companies, because essentially our free enterprise system is really based on the market, utility, self-interest, and how do we work with, public policy leaders, and I guess connectiveness between those 2 entities.
Well, this has a lot to do with framing, right? It has to do with how you explore with all sectors what is in it for them. And as was discussed before lunch, the private sector is where the resources are, and that's where what money is to be made will be made as well. So there are opportunities here beyond just social responsibility, mission or component of a corporation. There's a reason why corporations would like federal regulations, so that they can work consistently across states, right? They don't want state by state by state. Corporations are often very strong components of regulation or pricing, controls, of course. So I think it can be hard or easy, but at the local level, there are many reasons why private businesses and corporations would want to sponsor, participate in, be connected with, be beneficiaries of, invest in cooperative endeavors. They're surely going to benefit from the lake cleanup, right? There's going to be more recreation. There are going to be more businesses supporting recreational activities, or, I'm just talking off the top of my head here, but the idea is that if you frame the problem as larger than zero emissions, you're creating opportunities. I talk about it's not just about expanding the pie to a bigger pie. It is turning it into an apple cobbler, Because if you frame it in a way that creates more opportunity, you can attract more diverse and deeper pockets as well. I think that goes for the public sector too. And I'm not sure how else to respond to that, except that if you're disconnected from people and organizations who in fact do influence public decision making and private investment, you are only going to be able to go so far, especially if you're dealing with a wicked problem which everyone needs to be involved in. So reframing your tool set, reframing who you think of as stakeholders, reframing the problem, I think is important for us to be thinking about. You had another question, but maybe I should take the, yeah.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Emerson, thanks for coming today. You spent a lot of time talking about how collaboration is not an independent variable in this, solution formula, and how there's a huge amount of effort that goes into building and sustaining these collaborative governance structures. You also talked about the New Talk Planning Group that sprang up specifically because there was a vacuum in the existing institutional space. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the role of existing institutions and existing governance structures in creating and sustaining these kind of collaborative governance structures.
I think it's huge. In Tucson, by way of example, the largest critical habitat plan in the country, the Sonoran Conservation Desert Plan, is largely a construct of county government and a very large 26-member stakeholder group, very diverse, that worked for many, many years to confront issues of development, conservation easements, location of infrastructure, and so forth. So I think that at the role, and you've read about this, of course, of hosts and conveners, let alone anything else, is very, very important. And of course, if you have a county government that no one trusts, or you have a very divided constituency, that may not be the place to begin thinking about institutional design. There you may have to go to a community leader in the Republican and the Democratic side and ask them to co-convene. I mean, I think that's part of thinking about how to set the stage to build legitimacy for new institutions. It's pretty general. But.
Nobody wants to hot pursuit, huh?
Thanks. Thank you for your really interesting talk. This is actually kind of a follow-up from your dialogue that you were having with Virginia in the very beginning of our question answer session. So I was just thinking about, she was asking about, how do you sort of create effective collaborations and sustainable collaborations when you don't have any resources, particularly financial resources. And it got me thinking about, when I think about collaborative capacities, I think about leadership.
Yeah.
And I think about the kinds of skills that exactly. But not only just legitimacy of leadership, but when you have those collaborations, you literally have individual human beings in a room together. And especially if they don't have financial backing, it's a question of what is their motivation for taking the time and the energy of sitting in that room. And even more than that, what the leadership skills that it takes, the organizational skills, the administrative and management skills it takes to actually create, effectively sort of an ad hoc sort of new institution,
yeah.
Sort of an informal institution. So I work, in my experience, I work more with sort of like localized, very local systems and local institutions. So maybe this isn't so much of an issue when you're talking at like a state or federal level, but how much of a limitation is that type of capacity, those type of skill sets when we're talking about these collaborations?
Somebody's got to do it, sorry.
Okay.
So, I mean, not only are there limitations in the capacity that we have, right, but there's also a stigma and just a negative perception that the public has, but certainly that decision makers and anyone who eventually would collaborate and initiate convening of something would have. Think of the 2009 healthcare forums, right? The summer of the town hall meeting where what happened? Organized interest showed up and captured the whole process, and nothing positive came out of that.
I actually am working on a project to look at disruptions of deliberative forums and the way in which organized actors come in and try to delegitimize these forums. I won't say anything more than that, but it is intriguing. I want to say something about leadership, though, and not to undervalue it at all. And I distinguish it from resources, but of course it's a resource. But if you think of collaboratives as leadership building factories, that's what you're trying to do, because it's about people, and they have to leave their organization at the table, they have to leave their constituency. The scientists have to be leading in the translation of knowledge. You know, it's all about turning people into public-minded leaders with these complicated set of self-interests and remember, accountabilities. And so I think that a determined leader who can project and attract others is absolutely essential, particularly when you're starting with the emergent setting where you don't have a government coming in and creating an opportunity for a collaborative system. So I think that leadership is absolutely critical. Of course, I think all of these are critical.
Hi, Kirk. My name's Amy, and I'm an MPA candidate. I'm actually interested in, you were talking about this a little bit just now, sort of the tipping point of where you go from informal gathering to more formalized structure, sort of a backbone organization type of model. And we talked about limited resources. It's a constant concern. And there are so many functions that these backbone organizations can undertake. So they can be conveners, they can be information gatherers and disseminators, advocates for issues, things like that. So when they are constrained by limited resources, or they're trying to build up legitimacy and trust in a separate organization, a formal institution, do you see more success in picking and choosing a couple of those functions, or which functions do you think are the best to sort of build that up and then move forward and keep going on that? I mean, we've sort of touched on a lot of things, so.
No, I don't think I don't have an answer to that. I think it'd be a great study to try to see what among these critical management resources are there any rules of thumb here? Is it all different? The answer obviously lies in the group. What do they think is most critical? And for those of you who've read our JPART people, we talk about a theory of action and a strategic approach to how to solve the problem. And so embedded in that strategy, that theory of action is the baseline capacity of the group. And to have a theory of action or change that completely ignores constraints is not to have theory. And so you want to continually revisit this. As you build more resources, perhaps you can effect change in a different way or at a different scale. But I guess I would go back to that theory and think about how to move forward.
Good afternoon. My name is Vantia Elizabeth. I am thinking about the panel discussion from this morning on education, and in particular about how towards the end there was a lot of stipulation on leadership and how it was not sustainable, at least at the highest level at like superintendents, and how it was kind of the running game of these people are only going to be here for 2 years. And I'm thinking with your presentation, we're talking about collaborative governance, we're talking about people, stakeholders coming from all walks of life and, trying to attack these problems. Well, when you have, in the case of leadership in certain sectors, a large changeover, and then it seems as though you have to go back to the drawing board because these are different people in government. They're different people with different agendas. Can you just talk about kind of the changing, changing diameters, changing factors that people have to think about when, leadership does change in a very short amount of time, and how to attack these problems?
Yeah. I was not at that session, so this, but I think it's an important question more broadly. And again, leadership isn't just at the top, and collaborative processes don't work if people aren't effective advocates, right? So you need both effective advocates of those diverse perspectives, but that the group creates a platform for effective advocacy too. And part of that's done when they make explicit the theory of action, and they can do certain things and explain to the next set of leaders what has been invested, what the outcomes are. Again, we talk about how important it is to be able to think ahead to how you define success, what are your measures and milestones. And I think in some of these transitions, there's this sort of dependency thing going on here. And you think, oh, it's the leader, right? But, you know, I think leaders aren't going to throw away good things and popular things, generally, as a rule. Some might, some bad, you know. But if they're going to be informed by those who are feeding them information, advisors as they move forward, the more you can be explicit about why and how you're coming together and the benefits that can be or should be achieved, effectively advocating for this and putting that in place. If you know in 2 years you're going to be gone, then again, what can you accomplish, and what should be part of that portfolio of action that you're going to try to create with your limited resources.
Okay, so this will be the last question, Nicole.
Well, it's not quite a question, but I'm doing the piggybacking, so.
Good.
Great.
And this is, good, well, hello again. My name is actually Nicole. Kind of met you out in the food table earlier. And so just kind of to piggyback off of what Teal was talking about, particularly in the case of the discussion we had on education earlier, I think to put that into context more is that you had leaders coming in who had high expectations placed on them to bring about change very quickly, which, you know, in the larger discussion of a wicked issue and placing education within that in a wicked issue, everyone from teachers even to parents will know that it's kind of difficult to expect immediate change, particularly when it comes into learning and children. And when you talk about what's your measurement of success when your measurements don't even quite, and this was one of the commenters, one of the panelists said, you know, the things that we test children on, particularly the NAEP, was what they brought up, doesn't even test all the things that teachers and people are expected to teach children. Right. And so to bring that back up into a discussion of leadership, and as you said, thinking about advocacy and how, in the case of education, a lot of that, they kind of left us with this idea that it's coming from the bottom, and it's going to be, they talked about big D democracy, small d, and it's going to become small d. So you have parents, people in the community who are going to start advocating for change in that, moving forward and keeping the agenda on pace. But, and I can ask you to speak to this, but it's different in that case where within that, with education, they're asking for these quick changes, and if you don't see immediate impact, it's like, okay, we're going to go to one of another models, and they're particularly asking a new leader to come in and implement an entirely new process, instead of potentially giving one process the chance to work over time. So it's kind of looking at a long time systemic issue, but looking for immediate results, which definitely kind of bumps into heads with each other. So
yeah, well, I mean, this is an enormous systemic conversation that, and you just said it, it's going to take a long time, and there are going to be a lot of missteps along the way. Arizona just opted out of the Common Core curriculum, for example. I mean, you know, they'll come back in though in 5 or 10 years when something, you know. So I guess if we're talking not about creating new institutions necessarily, we're reforming existing, hardwired, very complex, rigid bureaucracies, even with the most devoted human resource teachers that we can, you know, want. You know, there isn't an easy answer here, and you know, a lot of collaborative shifts, I think, occur, and others have written about this, out of failures of past policies. So you might see an opportunity opening up when all of this crashes down and nobody, you know, performs on the tests and teachers are leaving, and, you know. time. I think that's another thing, to not realize this takes a long time. It takes a long time, and don't get discouraged about it, because we're talking about human beings here. It takes a long time for them to get wise. They had to live through their life, but thanks.
Professor Emerson, thank you. We want to leave you with some Maxwell swags.
Oh,
Please.
cool.
Yeah.